Snowflake's massive data breach, the dark side of artificial intelligence, and integrating business and technology to scale for growth. Those are just a few of the topics we're going to cover here in episode 176 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberly.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name is Eric Kimberling, and my co-host, Darian Fiakuski, would normally be with us, but she's out ill today, so it'll just be me here solo today, but thank you for joining. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And Third Stage Consulting is also the sponsor of the show, and the show is produced by Major Tom Productions. You can find new episodes every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com, and you can also see all the past episodes of this show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com as well. Got a great episode for you today. We're going to get into some social media questions and articles to start this show. We're going to get into Snowflake's data breach that just recently affected millions of people throughout the world. We're going to talk about a few different threads around the dark side of AI and some of the challenges and complications that are emerging as a result of artificial intelligence. We'll also talk about how Apple is beginning to embrace and potentially incorporate OpenAI into its product suite. And then later in the show, we're also going to talk about how to integrate business and technology to scale for growth. We're going to have a guest on the show. Her name is Kimberly Eubank. She is a M&A integration and business transformation expert. She's going to be on the show with me to chat about how to integrate businesses and technology operations to scale for growth, including organizations that are going through mergers or acquisitions or are just growing quickly, and they're trying to figure out ways to standardize their operations. Those will be some interesting threads that we'll cover there. And then later in the show, we are going to play you a clip from one of our sister podcasts called Journey to S4HANA. And it's a podcast that's devoted to SAP implementations, but we had a guest on recently named Jocelyn Hain, and her guest appearance was very good because she talked about some implementation best practices around SAP implementations. And even if you're not implementing SAP, most of what we talk about, if not all of what we talk about in that interview, is going to be relevant for any organization going through any sort of ERP implementation or digital transformation. So be sure to stick around for that. We'll play you that great clip here later in the show. But to get started, I actually want to start off with some of these articles, some of these noteworthy articles, because there's some really interesting ones that have emerged in a recent week. A lot of interesting news that has emerged here in recent weeks. And the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the Snowflake data breach. And if you haven't heard about this, there's an article on Wired magazine and several other media outlets that we've seen here in recent weeks that talks about how there's a significant data breach involving cloud storage provider Snowflake. And the breach impacted several major companies that use Snowflake, including Advanced Auto Parts and LendingTree, which I believe both of those are American-based companies with global operations and big American-based global organizations as well. And sensitive data from millions of customers' employees have potentially been exposed, making it one of the largest data breaches in recent history. And it also highlights the critical need for strong cybersecurity measures and rigorous data protection protocols within organizations to prevent such extensive breaches. And, this is a really interesting story because I think, a lot of times this gets overlooked, this risk that we're facing in this cloud environment that we're all operating in, or that most of us are migrating to if we're not already in it. And the reason it's such a big deal is because you look at a cloud provider like Snowflake, which is becoming a very large cloud services provider that helps organizations with BI and analytics and really integrating data across platforms. And it's a very robust company, sophisticated company with presumably very sophisticated and mature cybersecurity measures. And it makes you wonder if an organization like Snowflake can experience a hack like this, then what about the average, mid-size cloud provider or smaller cloud provider, or even worse, a mom and pop IT organization within a mom and pop organization? How secure can an IT group with less sophistication or less maturity or less resources, how robust is their cybersecurity policy really going to be? And I think that's something we've got to think about as technology professionals, is what do we do to help mitigate that risk? The other thing we've got to think about too, that I think is very important, is as we're evaluating cloud providers, certainly we want to make sure that we've assessed the cybersecurity measures that are in place with the cloud provider. But we also have to look at what sort of cybersecurity measures that we as an organization still need to have in place. Just because we're using an organization that presumably has world-class cybersecurity measures doesn't mean that it's 100% foolproof. For example, if we don't have the right security measures in place internally within our own organizations, there are going to be breaches. There's going to be data that gets out because of human error or because of nefarious activities from employees or hackers or whatever the case may be. And the other part of this too that we have to think about is in these sort of best of breed interoperable sorts of environments that a lot of organizations are moving toward, which has a lot of upside potential, there's a risk. Anytime you have multiple systems that are tying together and talking to one another, you have the risk that one vulnerability in just one of your systems throughout a chain of multiple systems, that one vulnerability can actually become a cybersecurity issue across platforms and across your data sets and across your operations. So I think that's something to keep in mind, and something that we can learn from. I guess the question here is there anything that, in this case, Advanced Auto Parts or Lending Tree could have done to avoid this? Is there anything Snowflake could have done to avoid this? I don't have enough detail at this point to know how exactly that breach happened, other than to say that it is pretty well documented that it's outside hackers that through the dark web and other sources that found a way in to Snowflake and into the data sets of those two organizations in particular. If I remember correctly too, I think in another article I read, I think Ticketmaster and some other organizations were also suspected to be at risk as well, or suspected to be part of the hack as well. If I remember correctly, I think Ticketmaster was actually the one they were going after, but then they ended up hacking into some other systems as well. At the time we're recording this podcast, I know there's a lot of information that's still coming out regarding this breach, and there's a lot of new emerging developments in it. So I'm sure we'll learn more as things unfold and as more information becomes public. But it is something that's worth noting that there is risk with cloud. There's certainly risk with on-prem, but it does make me wonder if some of these big, massive cloud providers are just going to be bigger targets and have more aggressive attacks, because there's so much to gain if you're a hacker. There's so much to damage to be done, or data to be stolen, or whatever the case may be. So that's something to keep in mind, and it heightens the sense of urgency around making sure we've got strong cybersecurity policies in place internally, as well with any third-party service providers that we might engage with as well. So interesting stuff there for sure. Now, another interesting article here is regarding Apple. Apple has recently announced that they are looking to integrate advanced AI features into its iOS and macOS platforms by partnering with OpenAI. And they're working on incorporating generative AI capabilities, such as what you would find in ChatGPT, into iOS 18, which would be a new operating system for the iPhone. And the initiative is part of a broader effort to enhance the intelligence of its devices, offering more personalized and efficient user experiences. The new AI features will be opt-in, allowing users to opt out or not opt in if they're concerned about privacy, to avoid them if they choose. And additionally, Apple has been hiring AI experts and exploring partnerships with other AI firms like Google to strengthen its AI capabilities. And just to build on that too, if you recall recently, we covered this in this podcast, where Apple has recently pulled money away from, or sort of shut down its self-driving car initiative, because they wanted to double down on AI. And it sounds like they're definitely doubling down on AI from what I'm seeing here and what we're seeing in the news. But this is really interesting because I think incorporating an end user device like an iPhone into OpenAI has a lot of interesting implications, both positive and negative. On the positive side, AI now and OpenAI models, OpenAI in particular, in this case, if they do partner with OpenAI will have access to such mass amounts of data, even if some subset of people opt out. I mean, now all of a sudden you're talking about massive Internet of Things sorts of implications where think about all the information you've got on your iPhone about you, about your health, about your, how much activity physically you are engaging in on a daily basis, all of your work, your leisure, your, Instagram reels and TikTok videos that you watch, your Google searches, all that stuff now suddenly as a potential data point that could be used by OpenAI to teach it, for it to learn more about you, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of training that could happen and a lot of learning that could happen with AI models by having these mass amounts of data. So I think there's a lot of potential for AI to get smarter and more powerful, more advanced, a lot faster than it already is. And it's already moving at a very fast pace, but even faster if we could get more data into these machines or into these learning models. But that brings up a dark side, which is, what about privacy? What about data privacy? I mean, we're all worried about data privacy as it is. There's European rules around data privacy that will probably spread to other parts of the world as well. So what does that mean if OpenAI has access to what you're doing on your phone and, certain data sets on your phone? What does that mean for your privacy? Is there a violation there? Is there concern? Could it be breached? There's a lot of interesting questions that come of that. In fact, shortly after I saw this article, or that we saw this article on our team, I actually saw just a few days ago, Elon Musk posted on his X account. He posted something about how he thought that this move by Apple was an unacceptable cybersecurity risk. And he's basically saying that there's no way that he would ever advocate for that sort of open access to data via OpenAI. However, I will say shortly after he made that post, within several hours, he posted another post that said, would you buy a Tesla phone that provided advanced security features and privacy features if it was available? Yes or no. And he's sort of doing a poll. I don't know if that means they have one in the works or not. I didn't go down the rabbit hole of trying to discover that, but it did make me think, well, maybe, he might have a vested self-interest in seeing Apple not succeed in this initiative, or to sort of knock the initiative, if you will. But it is an interesting point, though. It is interesting around, is this a good thing? I know Apple devices in general have been known to be pretty secure, and in some cases more secure than Windows devices. I know it's a controversial statement, but there are IT professionals out there that would say that it is more secure. So it makes you wonder, would this undermine that perceived security that Apple has currently had or historically had? Are there privacy issues that might get violated potentially with GDR or GDPR in the EU? Those are all questions that I do not have answers for, but there's certainly things that we'll need to think about and keep an eye on as well. And then lastly, the last article I want to cover here today is also related to AI and the potential dark side of AI. And this is super interesting. Actually, this is a topic that came up in passing in a recent podcast interview. It was actually someone in the audience, and I don't recall which interview it was. It wasn't directly related to the conversation, but it was a really interesting point that sort of stuck in my head. And now we saw this article that sort of builds on this thread. And it's about how AI is affecting power consumption, energy consumption. And someone had mentioned it, and I don't remember the context, but someone in the Middle East, I think it was in Saudi Arabia. I think the participant was in Saudi Arabia, saying that Saudi Arabia is investing heavily in artificial intelligence because they have so much energy and access to energy. So therefore, that is sort of a natural byproduct or extension of their energy commodities. So they were using that as a sort of a springboard into investing more in AI and data centers and things like that. In this article that I want to talk about here today, though, is from the Morning Brew. And the Morning Brew article discusses the growing strain on the U.S. power grid, although I would assume the same strain is going to exist in other parts of the world as well. This article just happens to focus on the U.S. power grid. But it discusses the growing strain on the U.S. power grid due to the rapid expansion of AI data centers. These data centers require exponentially more power than traditional ones, leading to a surge in electricity demand forecast. States like Oregon and Georgia are revising their power demand projections significantly upwards. Additionally, new gas-fired power plants are being proposed to meet the needs of these energy-intensive facilities, raising concerns about the impact on climate change goals. Really interesting sort of dual issues there. One is energy consumption and having a infrastructure and a power grid that can support those growing energy needs. But then, of course, there's also the climate and environmental concerns as well, especially as much of the world is trying to move to clean energy and move away from its dependency on fossil fuels and trying to reduce energy consumption. Here we are creating something else that's sort of competing or conflicting with that, that's actually increasing energy consumption. And so the energy, or the article, talks about the increasing power demand due to AI data centers. And the question is, how do you see this affecting long-term energy strategies for tech companies? And, I think, maybe to broaden the question here, the topic here around energy strategies, it's also sustainability and ESG, environmental sustainability goals that organizations in many parts of the world are being forced to track and to monitor and show improvements on. I think it'll be interesting to see, this conflict unfold, because, certainly the world is demanding and consuming more AI. And I don't think, even if we wanted to, I don't know that we could really stop this AI train as fast as it's moving right now. But at the same time, in parallel, you've got that conflicting priority of wanting to, increase or decrease energy consumption and decrease dependence on fossil fuels and that sort of thing, and also optimize our impact on the environment. So those two things are in direct conflict, and I honestly have no idea how that will unfold. I think it is a conflict. It is something that something might have to win out, or something might have to give. I'm not sure what it is, but I think it's a super interesting food for thought. I'd be curious to hear the audience's comments on that too. What do you think? How do you think that'll unfold? Could these two competing priorities coexist? Will there be some sort of middle ground we'll find over time? I'd love to hear your feedback, because I do not have a good answer for it, but it's a very interesting food for thought, or thing to chew on here for the next, several months and years as it unfolds. And then, brings up another interesting question, which is, could AI itself, coincidentally or ironically, I'm not sure what the right word is, maybe it's ironically, could AI ironically be the one to optimize energy consumption that it itself is causing an increase or spike in? I think it possibly could. I think certainly, as a totally unrelated topic, power companies can and should be using AI to better predict energy consumption and demand. AI is a great tool to potentially do that, to predict demand for any organization trying to predict any sort of demand. I think AI is a great tool because it's so prone to human error, and we just haven't been good at it in the past. So why not leverage AI to do that? So it'd be interesting to see if AI itself could solve potentially the same problem it's causing, which is increased energy consumption and trouble forecasting energy consumption. What if AI could fix its own problem that it created? Interesting stuff there for sure. Don't know the answer to that either, but I would think AI potentially could start to solve at least that problem. I don't know that it'll solve the first problem, which is the energy consumption itself and the impact on the environment, but at the very least, it might be able to help us better predict energy consumption as well. So it's really interesting topics that came out of just the last couple weeks, and we'll certainly have some more next week as well as we get into it. So we want to shift gears, though, and come back to some audience questions. And before I get to those audience questions, though, I'd love to hear your feedback on this whole AI thread. Some of these conflicts I just mentioned, because these are sort of unresolved issues we're talking about here. So I'd love to hear your comments in the chat below for this podcast. But we're going to shift gears. While you're doing that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to get into some audience questions. We're going to talk about operational disruption and the two-tier ERP implementation approach. So be sure to stick around for that. And then later in the show, we are going to have two guests on the show. One will be Kimberly Eubank. She'll be on the show talking about integrating business and technology to scale for growth. And then also Jocelyn will be on later today to talk about ERP implementation best practices. So we're going to get to both of those guests here as soon as we take a quick break. We'll get to these audience questions, and then we'll get to those guests here later in the show. So be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. If you're using SAP, Oracle, or Microsoft Dynamics, or any other sort of legacy system, you might be feeling pressure to migrate to a more modern version of those legacy systems. However, there's another option out there. You can look at third-party support as a way to extend your life cycle and save money on your legacy systems while you figure out your own IT roadmap that fits your schedule. So there's a company out there called Spinnaker Support that supports, among others, SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft customers. And in general, Spinnaker customers are going to save 60% on their annual support maintenance.
they're going to get extended lifecycle support. So these are support levels that help organizations take control of their IT roadmap and give them an option that extends beyond the sunset period for what SAP, Microsoft, Oracle, and other software vendors are offering. So that's one of the things that's the beauty, is not only you're saving money, but it also gives you an opportunity to work past and have a roadmap that works past the timeline that the software vendors have given. In addition, you're going to deal with or leverage expertise from consultants and support professionals that have over 20 years of experience on average. You're going to get world-class security. You're going to get proactive support. So it's actually not just fixing stuff that breaks, but also ensuring that you get more value out of your system. And Spinnaker also provides global availability. So it's really important that you check out this as an option. There's third-party support providers like Spinnaker that can give you an option that takes some of that pressure off to have to feel like you have to upgrade your system right now. So to check out this concept and to learn more, I encourage you to read a white paper that we've provided for each of the listeners of this show. It's called The Skeptic's Guide to Third-Party Maintenance and Support. So there's a link in the description field of this podcast, so be sure to check that out. You can download that. You can learn more about what third-party support is, learn more about the advantages and what some of the common frequently asked questions are, and really just address any questions you might have. So be sure to check it out. It's from Spinnaker Support. You can download that paper for free, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. I'm gonna leave it all out there, and I'm gonna leave it all out there.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name is Eric Kimberly, and you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. This is the podcast that has everything to do with digital strategy, digital transformation, including the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation. You can find new episodes every week by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions, sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is the company I'm the CEO of. And we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And speaking of both Third Stage Consulting and Major Tom Productions, we are collaborating. Both companies are collaborating on an event coming up in October. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a tech agnostic conference that will be October 2nd through the 4th in Denver, Colorado in the U.S. 3-day event, lots of great networking, lots of great speakers covering all sorts of things related to digital transformation. A lot of technology-focused speakers, business-focused speakers, change-focused speakers, operations, program management sorts of topics, all sorts of stuff that we're going to be covering, everything you need to know related to digital transformation to be successful in your initiatives. We're doing early bird pricing through the end of June. So if you buy our tickets before the end of June, you'll get a 20% discount. You can go to stratosphere2024.com to see how the agenda is shaping up, as well as some of the speakers that are emerging. We're actually continuing to add to the lineup as we speak, but you can see how things are unfolding, and you can also look at last year's agenda and speaker lineup as well. And you can also see what other kinds of stuff we'll be covering in that event. Be sure to go to stratosphere2024.com. We'd love to see you there. I'll be there. I'll be speaking there, as well as other speakers from Third Stage Consulting and other companies, and other speakers that are not involved with Third Stage Consulting will be there as well. So it should be a great peer networking and learning experience. So be sure to check that out, stratosphere2024.com, and hope to see you there. I want to get into a couple social media questions we've gotten recently. One of them is related to a video I published recently that talks about how 52% of companies experience operational disruption at the time of go live. And this is data that we've tracked over a decade now. And in that probably 12 to 14 plus year period that we've been tracking this data point, which is how many, what percentage of organizations have operational disruption at the time of go live. And when I say operational disruption, by the way, I mean a material operational disruption, not just we had a few hiccups here and there, or it took us a little while to learn a new system. It's more, no, we didn't just have those sorts of problems. We couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. We couldn't run payroll. So something materially and big negatively impacted our operations. So that's what we mean by material operational disruption. And when we track that metric, it's been super consistent and steady over this decade plus that we've been tracking it. And it's been hovering right around 50%. It's hovered anywhere from 48 to I think 54% on the high side. So let's call it 50-50. The most recent number we have is 52% actually. So 52% of companies experience disruption to go live. And the question we have on social media is, how many of those companies, the 52% that experience operational disruption, how many of them expected disruption versus being fully surprised? That's a super interesting and a very good question. And I don't have a number for you, but just based on our experience when we do project cleanups and project recovery, which is unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, maybe fortunately from our perspective, unfortunately from the industry's perspective, a growing part of our practice and a growing part of our revenue, one of the fastest growing revenue areas is project recovery. In other words, solving problems that have already percolated. So either it's a failed implementation or it's a failing implementation, and companies will hire us to come fix it. And so that's a really high growth part of our business. And one of the things we're seeing and we're learning is that most organizations are, when they go live and have these sorts of problems, most of the time they are surprised by it. I would say you could make a very strong argument they should not have been surprised by it. And we look at it and say, we probably wouldn't have been surprised if we were involved from the start, but this company, for whatever reason, is surprised by it. So I'd say most organizations that get to the go live stage are surprised by it. They shouldn't be, but they are. I'd say, though, however, the good news, if there is a silver lining, is that we are seeing more organizations that are catching the problem sooner. In other words, they're bringing us in not just after the failure happens, but they are recognizing the failure happening in progress and then hiring us to come fix that. Now, that's still not as ideal as just doing it right from the start, but it's definitely better than waiting till the failure happens, having this material operational disruption, and then trying to clean things up after. That's the most expensive, the most disruptive, and the least recommended way that you could possibly do a digital transformation. So if you're going to run into problems, you want to catch the problems quick, and you probably will run into problems. It's just a matter of how quickly do you catch them and how quickly do you address them. And that's where, that's the $1 million question, is how do we do that? So to answer the question, though, I'd say 52% of organizations that experience operational disruption get to the go live and experience it. I would estimate that probably 3/4 of those organizations were surprised by it. But I would also argue that close to 0% of them should have been surprised by it. So I think it's a matter of just having the right advisors, not drinking too much vendor Kool-Aid, being a skeptic where you need to be a skeptic, being a bit paranoid about what's going wrong, because you need to be a bit paranoid. I know Steve Jobs always had the term he coined, healthy paranoia, which I think served him well. It served Apple well, and it certainly has worked for them. But I think we all need to have a dose of skepticism and paranoia when we manage these projects. We want to be optimistic, of course. We want to be strong leaders. We want to paint a future and look at the art of the possible and all that good stuff. But at the same time, we have to sort of be looking over our shoulder and looking around to make sure we recognize where the risks are, because there are risks, there are problems that are going to happen, because these are complex projects. So great question there. Here's another comment or question that's related to the interoperability model, or the two-tier implementation approach, where we've published some content about some of the pros and cons of potentially having a best-of-breed environment where you have multiple systems that are best at what they do, and instead of just finding one technology that's standard across the entire organization, you find multiple technologies that can do different things better than any one system could. And there are benefits to that, but there's also a downside. And this person on social media is asking about the downside. And the comment here is, my knee-jerk reaction is that you would be over-licensed in some aspect, and I wouldn't guide a customer into the scenario unless I thought there was a really compelling business case to do it. You would have to invest a lot of time up front in aligning master data. Who owns the record? Which version is the right version? How often do they sync, etc.? I think that you'd be headed down a rabbit hole. So I sort of agree, but I sort of don't with this person. I think, first of all, I would agree that if you can find a single ERP system that accomplishes your needs, delivers the business case you need, and you don't have to go down this best of breed, multiple system, two-tier ERP system model, then that's great. The problem is most organizations aren't going to find a single system that can do what they need it to do. More often than not, there's sort of a critical decision point to be had, which is, do we just go with one ERP system knowing it's going to water down what some of our needs are just in the name of technical simplicity? Or do we take on the risk of potential technical complexity knowing that we've addressed the business needs? And so I think there is a cost benefit that has to be made there, but I definitely would not go in with the assumption that you're going to start with a single ERP until proven otherwise. If you can find it, great. Like I said, I would just keep it like, if it's me, I say, let's look at all of our options, and look at what emerges as the top option. If all things are equal and we could either go single system or best of breed and we're going to get the same business value, the ROI analysis is about the same, certainly go with the single ERP system. That would be the easier option. But that's rarely the case. More often than not, there's a trade-off to be made. And the key becomes, well, how big of a trade-off is it? Can we live with the trade-off? And if we can't, then we might have to go with a best of breed model. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I think a lot of what this person is bringing up around the need to invest a lot of time up front, aligning master data, who owns the record, which version is the right version, all that stuff, I think you're going to have to do that anyway. So to me, the data issue is not as big of a deal as it used to be, because now you've got better integration tools. Most organizations have messy data to begin with, so they're going to have to spend that time up front anyway, regardless of whether you go with a single system or not. So I think, it's sort of a wash, in my opinion, as it relates to data. So I think it comes down to the business case. So I do agree with that. But I think you should be open-minded, because there's so many good options out there to help you potentially work with multiple systems in a way that's not as complex technically as it used to be back in the day, especially with products like, you've got products like Celigo and Palantir and Snowflake that provide these sort of platforms and integration tools, interoperability models, things that allow you to pull together systems in an easier way that you couldn't do in the past. So I think 20 years ago, I would not have said this. Now I would say this, and that is best of breed interoperability, two-tier ERP system is not a bad thing. And I strongly disagree that there's a material disadvantage to best of breed over single ERP system. Different priorities for different organizations, but that's my general comment regarding that. So great social media questions. If you have other thoughts or questions on either of these topics, I'd love to hear those in the chat below. Drop those in the chat if you agree. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me on this whole thing related to two-tier ERP systems versus single ERP system? Love to hear your comments in the chat below, so be sure to drop those in there. And while you're doing that, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to bring on our first guest. Kimberly Eubank is going to be on to talk with me about how to integrate business and technology to scale for growth. So if you're a high growth organization, mid-size, large global organization, whatever you might be, and or if you're going through merger and acquisition or just organic growth, love to have you listen in on this, because we're going to talk about those topics here and how to standardize operations, how to integrate for growth, all that good stuff here in just a moment. And then later in the show, we'll have Jocelyn Hayes on the show, who was a guest on our sister podcast called Journey to SAP S/4HANA. She was on talking about some best practices for SAP implementations and some lessons learned, but it's actually 99.9% relevant to any sort of ERP implementation. So we want to replay that clip for you here on this podcast if you missed it on our sister podcast. And by the way, if you don't listen to or watch that sister podcast, if you are going through an SAP implementation, be sure to go to journeytosforhana.com to check out that podcast. We're wrapping up the first season as we speak, and there's I think 14 or 15 episodes out there already that you can go listen to there, journeytosforhana.com. But we're going to have Jocelyn Hayes on the show. We're going to play you the clip from that sister podcast here later in the show, so be sure to stick around. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Kimberly, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name is Kimberly, and you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also find past episodes of the show at transformationgroundcontrol.com as well. So anything you've missed, if you want to go peruse past topics and episodes, be sure to check it out there, transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by my company, Third Stage Consulting Group, an independent and global consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions. So I'm excited to have our next guest on the show, first-time guest on this show. She's someone that has been involved with mergers and acquisitions and business integration over the years, beginning at AT&T, which is a large telecommunication provider in North America, and I think they're global as well, but they're based in North America. But she's also done it for other organizations too. So we thought it'd be great to have her on the show to talk about how to integrate business operations and technology to scale for growth, either as part of organic growth and or merger and acquisition sorts of growth as well. So with all that being said, Kimberly, thanks for being here today.
Thank you very much. And I am in Atlanta today. That is where I live. And so I'm coming from you from my home office. I have spent most of my career doing transformational work. I spent almost 20 years with AT&T. And I would say that my transformation and kind of M&A journey started actually with the merger and acquisition between AT&T Wireless and Singular Wireless. I led the day one readiness for their merger integration, which at the time was the largest all-cash deal in the history of the U.S., $41 billion, and it impacted about 46 million customers. So that's kind of how my fascination with transformation began. And then I've been since then in a series of other companies, in a series of other industries, leading change and transformation. And so I've done customer service transformations, I've done digital transformations, I've done end-to-end customer journey transformations. I've been in telecom, financial services, manufacturing. So I've been around the block where transformation is concerned.
And some pretty large ones too, which I'm really excited to talk about. I mean, it sounds like you've been involved with a variety of transformations, but I'm fascinated by some of the large integrations you've been involved with. So I definitely want to jump into that here as we get into today's conversation. So before we get into some of the specific sort of examples and case studies of situations you've been involved with, maybe just tell us a little bit about what are, when we talk about standardizing operations, what are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face when they're trying to create a common operating model or trying to act like one company after they've grown through acquisition or potentially just through organic growth? A lot of times they start to act like several different companies. They have inefficiencies. They're a bit disconnected, and they look around and say, hey, we want to standardize operations. We want to act like one company, or we want to have a unified operating model. What are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face when they're trying to go through that process?
I think very few companies know actually how to do that. They don't know how to standardize. They don't know how to bring the two sides together. So one of the big ones, of course, is always culture, right? Just because you purchase a company or you do a joint venture with another company doesn't mean that your cultures are going to merge and work together seamlessly without effort. So I think the cultural aspects are always at the core of any merger integration, and it's probably something that leaders don't spend enough time figuring out a game plan around. I think the other thing is just people being entrenched in the way their company did it and thinking that their way is the best, and really being open to redefining the process for the betterment of both of the organizations. Because the reality is there's probably some good stuff on both sides, and you have the opportunity to, you have a blank sheet of paper, you have the opportunity to really look at this and make it world class across both entities. But if you're entrenched in the way your company's done it, or all of the corner cases, I think sometimes we get lost in corner cases as well. Instead of taking care of the 90%, we're focused on the 2 or 3% of the corner cases that, oh, you can't do that because, right? So those are some of the common pitfalls that I see.
Tell us about the corner cases. Are those is another way to frame that? Are those the squeaky wheels, or the way things have always been, so therefore we don't want to change? Is that sort of what you mean by the corner cases?
The exceptions to the rule, right? So 95% of the customers flow through this one way, but you have this really weird customer type or situation where you sell to something that's completely different from everything else. And so you've created your own kind of kludgy process to handle that, or you've put in a lot of custom automation to handle those types of use cases. And so, instead of evolving the 95 or the 97% of the customers, you kind of have stayed static because of that 3% of the customers that are, quite frankly, holding you back. And the reality is you can do both, but you just have to be open to reimagining the both sides of that, the 3% and the 97%.
Yeah. Why, when companies are growing or scaling for growth, either again through acquisition or organic growth, why is standardization so important? I guess if we just back up even more.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to scale gracefully if you're like most companies, most startup companies. Most startup companies are doing things through sheer brute force, right? They didn't have the automations in place. They maybe didn't have the talent to even know they needed the automations in place. They grew kind of organically over time, and often you get out in front of your skis, right? And your growth starts surpassing your ability to handle the day-to-day operations. And so what I find when I go into those companies is there's a lot of things still being done manually, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of people. I had an old CEO at a company calling it sneaker net, right? That people just walk from desk to desk to desk to get things done, even in this day and age. And so that's just not something that you can scale gracefully. And so one of the things when I go in and do an assessment of a company that I like to ask people as I'm doing the interviews is, okay, so your company has to triple in size in 3 years or 5 years or whatever the goal is, assuming you're not going to get more people, right? Because we're not going to put more hamsters on the wheel, right? Assuming that you're not going to get more people, what things have to be fixed or automated or reinvented in order for you to handle 3 times the work with the same number of people? And when you phrase it like that, then people start to open up a bit about, oh, well, if you ask me like that, then if you're not going to give me 5 more people to keep doing this manually, then I would need help with this thing and this thing and this thing.
Right. Yeah, it makes total sense. And then some of those inefficiencies that you build because you can get away with it when you're smaller, they start to multiply, and suddenly you look around and you see that, wow, we're not only highly inefficient, but our customers are experiencing not disruptions necessarily, but a disconnect in our brand and a disconnect in the way we operate and a disconnect in the experience they get from operating with, different parts of the organization. So it seems like I can see how that would start to add up over time.
When you start to create your own monster. I mean, I had a company that I worked with that their tax exemption process was very manual, right? And so they ended up having to do a ton of workarounds. Well, we can't send this email that has taxes in it because the customer might not be, actually supposed to be taxed. So we need to have a way to hold that email in the case where, you know, the tax exemption status hasn't finalized yet, and that builds and that builds and that builds. And then as you're building even new things, you have to keep remembering all those workarounds that you put in place for very valid reasons at the time. There's always a reason. There's always a reason why something has been done the way it's done. But the reality is sometimes the time for that has passed, and you just have to kind of say, you did your service. You did what you were supposed to do for the time that you were there, but it's time to move on and move past that way of doing things.
Right. So you talked a little bit about culture and what a big challenge culture can be when standardizing operations. And I know you've shared with me in the past some metrics around M&A integrations and the dismal success rates, or in other words, the high failure rates of M&A integration. What are some of the, I know culture is probably one of them, but what are some of the main reasons why M&A integrations fail when there's a merger or an acquisition and companies are trying to come together as one? What are some of the biggest reasons that they fail?
Yeah, I mean, culture is a big one. I think not actually having a plan on how you're actually going to fully execute it. So I was taught to do M&A at AT&T, right? And so a Fortune 10 company, they had kind of a science about it. And so they were very aggressive about pulling the Band-Aids off quickly, right? So making sure that your org structure is defined before people are supposed to start, acting like one company, right? So I think taking too long to get your org structure together so that people know who they're supposed to be taking direction from. Making sure that from a leadership perspective, you have clearly communicated what that North Star is so that people know that on day one of being a combined entity, that they know what they're supposed to be going and doing. Because if you don't give them that clear direction, then they're going to just keep doing what they've always done because no one's told them to do anything different. Mm-hmm. And so I think whether it's an M&A or whether it's just your own company needing to digitally transform, and in my consultancy, I've kind of come up with a clear, ready, and aligned as 3 pillars that you need to do before you start spending money, before you start, buying things, to make sure that you're clear on why you're doing it and what you want to be when you grow up, to make sure that your organization is ready culturally and skill set wise, right? If you have brought together 2 companies who have been keeping their lights on in the technical space for the last 10 years, and now you're looking at, oh crap, we have to integrate all this stuff. We have to rethink processes. We have to drive for completion dates. You probably don't have this mindset or the skill set on your teams to do that, right? Because it has been very much status quo in both of those organizations for the last 10 years. So I think just taking the time to set yourself up for success, making sure leadership is aligned around where you're going and how to get their teams there, that they're advocating for the changes in the same voice. I mean, making sure that your leadership team is really singing off the same sheet of music is important, because you can't, I talk about, being aligned at 50,000 feet is very different than being aligned at 500 feet. And I've seen so often in transformations or merger integrations where people nod their head at 50,000 feet because it's mom and apple pie. Yeah, sure. We got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. But I think in the back of their heads, a lot of them are like, well, that's everybody else has got to change. My organization doesn't have to change. How my team does work doesn't have to change. And then there's going to come a time when their team does need to change. And then you start to see the friction, right? Because they really weren't aligned at that lower level of granularity. So I think all of those things play a part. But culture absolutely can eat strategy, all the time. You can have the best laid plan, but if your culture isn't conducive to working together and bringing things together, it very quickly can sabotage your efforts, which can cost you a lot of money in the end of the day.
We're here with Kimberly Eubank talking about how to integrate business and technology for growth. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. recently published my first book. It's called The Final Countdown, Strategies to Reach the Third Stage of Digital Transformation. And I wrote this book because I really wanted to find a concise way to share some of my knowledge around digital strategy and how to get started on a digital transformation journey. So in this book, I cover 3 different sections. I cover the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation, with the idea that it's meant to be a starting point, a launching pad for organizations and team members that are going through digital transformations. So I encourage you to buy this book. You can get it electronically, you can get it paperback, or you can get it in hard copy as I'm holding here in front of you. You can get it by going to thefinalcountdown.com. You can also search for it on Amazon if you shop at Amazon. Otherwise, just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Love to hear your feedback on this book as well. So I hope you check it out and hope you enjoy.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me or visit our website for more details.
These things take time, Mom and Dad, they have a good life. But what am I gonna do with mine?
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name's Eric Kimberly. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Kimberly Eubank. We're talking about how to integrate business and technology to scale for growth. Culture is so hard to see and touch and feel. You know, you can look at an operating model and say, okay, those are 2 different business processes or 2 different ways of operating, or you can look at an org structure and say, okay, that is or that isn't what we want. It's fairly tangible systems. Same thing. You can look at the technology that's being used. You can sort of see it black and white, for better or for worse. But culture is a lot harder to describe and quantify and get your arms around. How have you seen organizations sort of get their arms around 2 different cultures or multiple cultures if they're going to potentially acquire or integrate with another company?
Well, I mean, I've seen it done a lot of different ways, some to more success than others. I think, again, going back to my days at AT&T, they literally, if you're a sci-fi fan, we used to say we are the Borg, we will be assimilated, because they had a leadership development track that they put us through, called Leading with Distinction. And every single year you went to Leading with Distinction, and they picked a theme, whether it was innovation, where they talked about, we want to innovate, we want to fail fast, resilience, right? There's a lot of change, how to be resilient with the change. There's a different theme kind of every year. And they put all the different levels of the organization through what we, colloquially were like an indoctrination program, right? To make sure that we understood what those pillars that they wanted us to be. And I think I worked with a company recently that had what they called a from to model. Here are our current behaviors, and we want to go from this to these new behaviors, right? And so however you phrase it, I think you as a leadership team really have to come out with, these are the behaviors that we want you to perform to going forward and to manage your teams to going forward. So I've seen that. And during that program, actually one of the consultants that came in to do that program said it takes 7 years to change a culture, to really change a culture. And I believe that. Now, do I think a transformation or M&A can take 7 years? Absolutely not. You got to get your technology and all of your synergies from the purchase. You have to have that way under 7 years, but supposedly 7 years to change a culture. I've seen other organizations go at it very methodically, but very slowly, layer by layer by layer. Like year 1, we'll work on the executive team and make sure they're aligned. And then year 2, we'll work on the VP level. And then year 3, we'll work on the director level. That to me takes too long. I've had other companies that haven't worked on it at all. They just thought it was magically going to happen, right? And that doesn't work. Spoiler alert. And then I've had others that I think that they thought, well, if we just show them with the technology and whatever, people will just get it. They'll figure it out as they go. I think the biggest thing that you have to do, though, whatever model you pick, is you have to have accountability around the 2 behaviors. right? Once you define what from and to is, then you need to hold people accountable to the twos. And if you start seeing them regress back to their from behaviors, you got to call them on it. And that's where I see leaders not really sticking with the program, right? Because it's easier to let people just, be what they've always been. And so sometimes, there's a little dust up when you're holding people accountable to the two. But I think accountability is a huge part of cultural change. And it doesn't have to be rough. It just has to be, in a meeting when it's not being conducted in the two manner, right? Just saying, hey, part of our from twos is we're supposed to be thinking about this way. Are we really doing that here? Like maybe we should take a step back, right? So there's ways to do it that are non-confrontational, but the repetition, just like a child watching, their cartoons, they have to watch it, a million times to get the concept. Adults need that repetition as well.
Yeah. So can you come back to those three pillars you mentioned before? I think you said clarity, readiness, and alignment. Were those the three?
Clear, ready, aligned. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe unpack those a little bit more, just each of those three? And I also want to ask you a follow-up on why it sounds, so far from what I understand about it, it sounds fairly intuitive, but it sounds like it's not intuitive in terms of how organizations approach M&A. But maybe explain the three first, and let's come back to why organizations don't follow this approach.
Yeah. So clear is kind of assessing your future state, your current state, your motivation. Why do you want to do this, right? I worked with a client one time who, I honestly feel like they were doing a transformation because everybody else in their industry was doing a transformation, and they felt like that was just the thing they needed to do, right? And they didn't have a clear line of sight to what they wanted to be or what they were trying to get out of it. And so when you don't have that clarity of why you're doing it and what you're going to be when you come out, you're not going to be able to articulate that clearly to your workforce, and therefore you're not going to be able to get the buy-in. I think the other thing that the clear pillar does is it talks about vulnerabilities and feasibility, right? You could know that your business needs this, but, is it feasible that your company can do it? Can you, what are the roadblocks that would stand in your way from a leadership perspective? So clarity is just kind of a double click. Most companies can pass that pillar decently, but I have seen some that really struggle to be like, well, everybody else is doing it. I just assumed I needed to do it too. And then when you get to readiness, that really talks about the cultural piece of it. Is the mindset of your employees, do they believe they need to change? Have you made that case to say, look, if we don't change, this is the bad outcome that's going to happen, right? We can't continue to just be what we've always been. That's off the table, right? So something has to change, and here's why. Also, the what's in it for me, right? The skill sets, right? So I talked about if you've had a maintenance organization for, the last 10, 15 years, it is unlikely that you have the innovation and the drive skill sets to actually undertake a transformation internal to yourselves and be able to accomplish that with any degree of speed and efficiency. Budget. Can you afford this, right? Because transformation costs money. And so you might want it and desire it, but if you can't earmark several $1 million to it, then you're probably not going to be able to do a transformation. You might be able to select certain improvements that you can go do and make those incremental, and they may have big impact, but don't go out with a talk track that says it's a transformation, because it's not. You're going to be doing pocketed solutions. So those types of things are the things that you talk about. Commitment and patience are two other things in that track. And that's really focused at senior leadership, right? Are they committed to making the hard decisions, right? Because the reality is some people probably are going to have to exit during a transformation, right? Or during an M&A. There's going to be somebody that doesn't want to get on the change train, right? And those people, sometimes you can move them into roles where they're less, impactful to the change. But other times, they're a little toxic to the environment that you're trying to create, the new culture, and you may have to exit them, or they may vote themselves off the island. Either one of those things, right? And then patience. And that's the thing that I see senior leadership struggle with a lot. So when you're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars, you want to see the shiny, sexy thing at the end that you can tout and that you can talk about to employees and customers. But the reality is M&A and transformation is a heck of a lot of integration work. It's cleaning your data. It's getting your plumbing and your electrical in line, because you don't want to be doing fancy things and displaying things to customers that isn't accurate or isn't timely, or it's not showing the right answer. And so as a result of that, the first year or two can actually be very much behind the curtain. And it's not sexy and it's not exciting, but it's very critical to getting all the other stuff right. You're building your foundation. And so I've seen senior leaders really struggle with the patience, because they're like, but I gave you $10 million. What have you done with it? And if they can't see it and touch it and feel it, they have a very difficult time understanding this is a building block, right? And you got to let us do it sequentially, and you got to let us get to the building block. And then the last pillar, which is alignment, is really about making sure that you're aligned at less than that 50,000 foot view, right? And so it's making sure that you have the advocacy, that the leadership team are going to sing off that same sheet of music, that there's not conflict, right? Goal misalignment is huge. So if you've had a maintenance organization, I'll just use an IT organization. If you've had an IT organization who's been treated as a maintenance organization for the last decade, and all you've been pushing on them is cost control, cost control, cost control, there is going to be an inherent conflict between innovating and driving new solutions and cost containment. Those two are usually mutually exclusive. So all of those types of things are things that people jump into transformation, but they don't think about those, what I call the 13 competencies. They don't think about how their organization lines up with each of those competencies. And the reality is, if you can identify that you're going to have a rub there, or you can even address the rub before it happens, it's going to help with your efficiency and your speed and your buy-in. It's going to help you go faster and actually spend less money, because you're able to go more smoothly and you're able to go faster. And a lot of companies just dive in and are like, yep, we're doing this, let's go. And then those things that were foreseeable and addressable end up biting them in the patootie, because they didn't think about them ahead of time.
I had a guest on here a couple years ago on this podcast, and she was a PhD, and she had studied a lot of psychology in addition to business and stuff that we talk about on this show. But one of the things she brought up that has really stuck with me is this concept of action bias, and how we as humans are wired to take action. So we're not wired to do the things you just described. We're not wired to make sure that things are clear and make sure we're aligned before we jump ahead. We're wired to do what you just described. Let's jump in, let's go, because we have that action bias. And so I think that's a super interesting dynamic that I think actually haunts a lot of transformations, because we have the right intentions in mind, because we want to get stuff done. We want to make it successful. But in doing so, we sort of run the wrong direction. We don't have the map. We don't have a blueprint for what it is we're trying to accomplish.
I mean, the old adage of proper planning prevents poor performance. Yeah, I mean, it does.
Yes. We're here with Kimberly Eubank talking about how to integrate business and technology for growth. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. People oftentimes ask me how I built such a strong social media following on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and other outlets. And the fact of the matter is it took me a long time to build a following through a lot of trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. Had I known that there were companies out there that could help me build my brand, I would have done that a long time ago. I didn't know that, but the good news is that there is today a consulting firm that will help you through building your own personal brand through some of their training programs. The company is called Roloff Consulting, and if you're familiar with Emma Roloff, she's someone that I've had on this podcast before, and she's well known in the digital transformation space as well as the sales space. and she's big on TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And she and her husband have started a training course and a training company that focuses on helping people build their personal brands and helping them to sell themselves digitally. So whether you're a salesperson that's trying to reach more customers or you're an individual that's just trying to build your personal brand, that's something that they help with through their training programs. And they've offered listeners of this podcast a free 5-day LinkedIn challenge. And I encourage you to check it out. I've included a link below for this podcast. If you go to the podcast notes, you'll find a link that gets you free access to this 5-day challenge where you'll get step-by-step guidance. You'll get real results. So you'll get some tangible results from the program. And you also get a special offer at the end of it. So it's exclusive to listeners of this podcast. Be sure to check out the link below if you want to work on building your personal brand, or if you're in sales and you're trying to reach more people. Whatever the case may be, check it out. It's free to listeners of this podcast. You can check it out via the link below.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology independent and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name's Eric Kimberly. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Kimberly Eubank. We're talking about how to integrate business and technology to scale for growth. Here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn. And Darian asks, what are some of the biggest change management and people challenges with integration and standardization? I know you talked about them maybe being stuck in the from and not focused enough on the to be. Is there anything else that you see from a people perspective that you think are some of the biggest challenges you've seen when trying to integrate operations?
I think it's the accountability. Accountability to actually, hold people to this is the new way forward. You can't regress. You can't go back. We're not going to do that. I worked with a company that every time something new was released, if there was any noise about the change, no matter how small the pocket of people were, right? Energy and attention was given to that noise that kind of stopped everything in the tracks, because you had to go deal with that noise. And I'm not saying ignore people's concerns, because there might actually be real post-production issues that you needed to address. But doing that in a way that is, okay, well, the change is happening. Like, we're not going to go back, but let's work through your specific issue. How you react to that as a leadership team is critical, because if you're constantly, oh, wait, do we need to pull that back? It's not perfect, right? If you constantly have that, then you're sending a signal to your team that maybe this change is optional. And maybe if I raise my hand enough and I'm a squeaky enough wheel, they'll just stop doing this and they'll go back to the way that they've done it before. So I think being committed to the forward plan, articulating that, realizing that 100% of the people are not going to be happy. They're not, because they liked the way they did it. And your job is not trying to make 100% of the people happy, right? It's trying to make, the 90% happier and make the experience better. And then holding folks accountable to the changes and the mindset around their change and their behaviors around the change, right? So, I literally was putting in a CRM suite, right? And there's different modules in the suite, some focused toward customer service, some focused toward sales, etc. And we had gone through the requirements gathering, and we had we'd put together the plan on the sales module, and it really came down to they were having budget constraints. And so it really came down to me actually saying, look, behaviors have to change. If you spend this money and you make these changes, you have to lead your sales force differently. And so if you're not willing to lead your sales force differently, then you should not do this project, and you should defer it, because you will be wasting money and people will not be happy with the change, because you're leading them one way and the system is directing them a different way, because the system was going to be put in place was going to have more data integrity, and so that we could automate things and things like that. And so you can't be quite as mushy in your processes if you're trying to automate and expose data and those types of things. And in the end, they decided that they weren't ready to change how they led their people in the sales organization. And as a result, we deferred the project, and they did not spend the $250,000 that it would have taken to make the change. And for them, that was probably the right decision, because I don't think that they were culturally ready for it. And I don't think that they were culturally committed to the level of organizational change that they were going to need to make the most of that module's functionality.
Yeah. Now, if we back up even more and look at, before you jump in and actually move forward with a merger or a decision to combine entities, you want to make sure that you see a path of how you might make it succeed. And this is an interesting question from Eduardo on LinkedIn. And he says, how does the leadership team know how fit an organization is for a merger? So if we sort of look at the pre-integration work that needs to get done in terms of the assessment and really doing the due diligence behind it, is this a good fit? Should we be merging companies here? Have you seen that side of it? And do you have any advice for organizations that are maybe thinking about or contemplating a merger?
Yeah, what I've seen is they talk about the product synergies. They talk about, filling white space and in the acquiring party's portfolio. They'll even really will look at the leadership team, the C-suite, and be like, can we work together?
Right.
What I've never seen them do, and I'm not saying that no one's done it, I've just never seen it, is I've never seen them talk about how work gets done. How do you guys do work? How do you tackle a problem? How do you make change, or do you make change, right? How do you finance work, right? Like one company could be like gut feel, yeah, we need to go do that. Give them, $500,000. That's great. Another may have a very structured business case process, right? So I think that's where I wish they maybe would double click a little bit more, is how do the teams actually interact all day long, and how do they get work? Because I can tell a couple things from a company. If your IT is reporting into your CFO, that to me is a sign you are probably a maintenance organization. You are not an innovation organization if you are reporting to a CFO. And I know that's a very European thing, that they have a lot of IT organizations reporting into CFOs. It's not my favorite model. The other thing is, when I go in to consult with somebody, I ask them for an email so that I can see people's calendars, so that I can just move meetings around more easily without having to go through a third party to do that. And if I walk into an organization and I have no trouble booking the meetings I need because everybody's calendar is wide open, I can tell you right now that they're not talking to each other enough, right? They're not having cross-functional conversations enough if their calendar only has 2 meetings a day on it. And I've seen that at a couple of companies, and I was correct both times. Like they were not talking to each other. Everybody was doing their own thing in a silo. Yeah. So I would really, really, really like people to spend more time figuring out how organizations get work done on the regular, because that's going to tell them a lot about how seamlessly the two are they problem solvers, or are they band-aiders?
Yeah.
You fix things at root cause, or do you just, slap a band-aid on it?
That's a really interesting data point, and it makes total sense. I've just never heard anyone say that. As far as like if there's not enough meetings, or if there's too few meetings, it means you're not collaborating. Because I think we get so obsessed with let's cut meetings. We've got too much bureaucracy. Let's get meetings off our plates. So to hear someone say maybe you should be meeting more because you should be collaborating more. That's such a not counterintuitive, but it goes against the grain of
Oh
what.
no, it is a contrarian opinion, but because everybody is like, oh no, too many meetings. Yeah, there's too many useless meetings.
Right.
But nobody's complaining if it is a productive meeting. And I grew up on conference calls, not even video calls, conference calls, right? Because we were a globally dispersed company and even a US dispersed company. So this whole talk track of you can't have a productive meeting remotely or over the phone or over video, I don't buy it because it's been my entire career.
Yeah.
Accomplished some pretty big things doing it that way. So I know
you have to talk, you do have to collaborate. I mean, meetings are okay. But you're right. If they're ineffective, if you're just having a meeting because you're supposed to have the meeting without any real purpose, then of course that's a different story. But
and I literally was at a company where there was a meeting that they had, I think once a month or something, and like 100 people would come on the meeting and nobody ever said anything. No one ever asked any questions. And I'm like, number one, I don't understand why there's 100 people on this meeting because they're not interacting. They don't care. But it was literally, well, it's on my calendar. I'm supposed to go to it. And I canceled that meeting because I took over the team and I canceled the meeting. Not one single person was like, oh, where'd my meeting go? None of them cared.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Didn't miss it.
Didn't miss it.
So what's the most difficult integration you've ever been involved with? I know you've done this a lot through your career, going back to AT&T, and you've done it quite a few times since then. But what's could you describe a case study or a use case of the most difficult one you've been involved with?
I mean, different ones are difficult for different reasons. So at AT&T was really the merger examples, and to be honest, they know what they're doing, right? The hardest part about the AT&T and Singular merger at the time was, so if we remember, Bell South and Southwestern Bell owned Singular. They actually bought AT&T Wireless, and so then AT&T Wireless became Singular. So the AT&T that you know today is not the original AT&T. We absorbed the original AT&T and then took their name. And so that was hard because they were both public companies, because they were both in the top 3 carriers. There was a lot of FCC and Justice Department scrutiny before the merger was approved. And there's a lot of rules around those kind of mergers, right? So we were not allowed to plan with the other party directly without parlor rooms and attorneys present, because we were still competitors until that merger happened. And we were both of significant size. So it was not going to go under the radar if we were talking to each other and behaving as anything other than competitors. And we couldn't have attorneys every minute of every day to be there. So the hard part of that one was we pretty much planned that in the dark. And where you had key like interfaces that you needed to build and things like that, yes, then we would set up a parlor room and we would have a conversation. But for the most part, the Singular side of the house defined the strategy, decided what needed to be done, guessed as well as we could, looked at publicly available information, called the 800 number, whatever we could do to get the information. But we planned that puppy in the dark. And then we only had 30 days to execute it once the merger closed. So that was hard just because of the constraints put on us, but it was easy because when we had the clear, ready, and aligned like competencies, we were firing on all cylinders. And so while it was a hard thing to do, it actually was one of the easier projects to run. The ones that are hard for me personally are the ones where you can't get out of your own way. And I've had a couple of those where, one that I worked on, they wanted to do the stuff in-house. They wanted to do the IT stuff in-house, but the IT organization was just not capable of doing it in-house, but they were insistent on doing it in-house. And as a result, things were just not going as fast as it needed to go. We were burning money. And it ended up being we're not where we should be on the plan. And so then, IT got defensive about scope, and the business was like, it's not a scope problem, it's a productivity problem. And so then you end up having a bunch of infighting. And that's just where the company literally they should have hired SIs hindsight 2020, they should have hired external SIs to just work the project. And that one would have been much easier. And then I've had another one where culture got in the way. The technical things were accomplished, but I have no doubt that if you go back and visit that company 5 years from now, because the cultural aspect didn't really click, I think that it was just a moment in time where they were brought up to date technically, but I think they're gonna continue to go back to what they've always been, and that's disheartening. So it's not hard; it's hard to watch it. It's
Right.
hard to know how the story's gonna end. And so those for me are the ones that are the hardest. When I know you could be more, I know you could do more, and for whatever reason, you're in your own way.
Right. We're here with Kimberly Eubank talking about how to integrate business and technology for growth. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey. Now let's jump back into today's content.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name's Eric Kimberly. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Kimberly Eubank. We're talking about how to integrate business and technology to scale for growth. You started to touch on this, and so this is a timely question from YouTube. In the context of M&A, what are the best practices for achieving data consistency and integrity while merging disparate ERP systems? And how can one standardize operations post-merger? Big question, very broad question, but let's focus on the technology piece because you were just sort of touching on that a moment ago. What are some of the just high-level general best practices for how you bring technology together and how you standardize technology and data across multiple entities when you're trying to go through that sort of merger?
Yeah, so I'll go back to AT&T. So AT&T at one point, the singular side of AT&T. So before the AT&T merger, it was singular, right? So it was the joint venture between Bell South and Southwestern Bell. And Bell South, when they had purchased entities, they integrated them within a couple of years. And so they ended up having all of their properties on one billing system, which in manufacturing call it an ERP, but in telecom we called it a biller or billing system. They had one. The Southwestern Bell side of the family had taken a completely different approach, and they had not integrated anything. And so when they kept acquiring, if you guys remember the cellular ones, right, there'd be a cellular one of Indianapolis and a cellular one of Chicago and a cellular one of Poughkeepsie. When they brought those into their fold, they didn't do any integrations. So when we became one and tried to form singular, there was something like 12 billing systems that we had to get down to one billing system.
Wow.
And so when I say data mapping, and more data mapping, I mean, that may seem so basic and old school, and there's probably a lot more modern ways to accomplish that. But really understanding the core elements of your data that you need to do business, right? Because 90% of it's going to be the same things. And then you've got to sit down and you got to decide on definitions, right? So even two people using the same ERP could be using fields in that ERP differently. And that's what I've found is the hardest part, because especially when you get down into small to mid-sized businesses, I'm gonna go to Vegas on your documentation is not up to sniff test, right? And so you're really relying on people's memories of, well, why did we do that? And how do we use that field? And does one department use that field differently than another department? And you don't even know it, right? And so it's tedious. There's no silver bullet for it. You've just got to sit down and you got to go through the data maps, and you've got to talk about the data, and you've got to decide on what your target data mapping is going to be, like what is, and then you've got to sit there and you've got to map everything across, and you'll have to take those those cases that, well, I use this field for that, well, I use that field for that, and you'll have to have that conversation and decide. So it's not fun. I mean, I guess some data-oriented people might consider that to be fun.
Some might disagree with you,
right? Like, but it's almost like forensic accounting on your ERP. And by the way, that isn't even in an M&A situation. That's just, you could have that same thing going from on-premise to cloud.
Right. Just a
right?
general migration.
Yeah, because I mean, a company that I worked with recently, had 15 years of just customization on top of customization on top of customization, and they're staring down going to the cloud over the course of the next year. And it does put some fear in your boots, because you don't really know what's under the covers. So you just got to peel those layers, the onions, one by one. So I don't know that I gave you a silver bullet on how to do that, but yeah, it's a lot of work, and it's detailed work, but it's so important. It's so important.
Yeah, I was looking for not only a silver bullet, but an easy button, but it sounds like you're not here to offer that up for us. It makes total sense. And you're right. A lot of what you're talking about, is not sexy. And you mentioned that earlier. A lot of this stuff is not sexy. It's a lot of behind the scenes grunt work, for lack of a better word, but it has to be done. And it's what's ultimately going to make it successful.
Now, what I am seeing though, is I am seeing companies come out that are actually, they've built the integration for you, right? So there'll be a company that you can actually purchase their software to help you get from on-premise to cloud, or to get from one ERP to another ERP. So that's something that, back in the day, you would have had to have built that all yourself. And so now people are commercializing that and making it repeatable. And so you still have to do the work to do the mappings, but the transfer over, I think there are companies out there specializing in that to make that a little simpler and seamless for you.
Yeah, makes sense. There's a question I want to elaborate. I'm going to change the question a little bit just to broaden it a little bit, but because I think it's a really good question that applies to multiple areas. This is from William on YouTube. William says a large M&A will have a host of layoffs due to redundancy, et cetera. How do you determine who stays and who goes? Do you defer to the acquiring company? And actually, why don't I broaden that? Just talk about people and technology. When you look at what people are going to stay or go, and what technologies or systems are going to stay or go, or how are you going to address technology? What's the sort of the pecking order or the hierarchy of how that typically works, or where you've seen it be most successful in terms of who determines what people, what technologies are going to stay or go?
Yeah. So in the technology space, I have typically seen that to be acquiring companies' tech is probably going to win, unless they're not happy with their solution. So let's say they're a Salesforce house. You're probably going to Salesforce, right? But let's say that their ERP, they don't like their ERP, or they're having issues with their ERP, or their ERP is on premise and your ERP is already in the cloud. In that case, they, if they're doing it the way they should be doing it, then they're looking at it and going, oh, well, actually, instead of bringing them over to on-premise and then having to take both of us to cloud later, let's just us go to cloud and go to your ERP and get it over in one fell swoop, right? So on technology, I have typically found that the acquiring companies technology will win, just because it's in place. And it's working. As long as it's working for them and it's already integrated into everything else, it's just one less thing that they have to deal with. On the people side, you know, there's going to be as many different flavors of this as the companies that undertake it. Yes, there will be redundancy. Yes, you don't need two people doing the same job. I have seen some companies, though, keep both sets of people for a long time because they're afraid that the historical knowledge isn't going to transfer. So they're afraid, and it's something legitimate that you should be concerned about. There's a lot of tribal knowledge that's in people's heads. It's not all going to be documented. And so I wouldn't be doing a mass cut 6 months in, right? I probably would wait a year to let people commingle and learn about each other. And then you've seen, number one, you've seen how they work. You see if they're on board with the new situation, and you can make specific recommendations, you know, specific to the people for that particular job. I will say that what I would do quickly is everybody has low performers. Everybody has people in their organization that they're like, oh my gosh, like I don't have enough to exit them. Like they're doing just the bare minimum to stay above that line. So I don't have enough to exit them, but I also don't have the leeway to offer them a package, right? Right when you merge, that's the time to try and get those folks out, right? Because you can offer some RIFs, some reduction in force packages, and you can target those people that you as a boss may have already had on your radar. They weren't adding value to one company, so the odds that they're going to be adding value to the combined company probably isn't high either. But for people who are contributing and are, you know, going along with the plan, I would keep them a little bit longer, and I would build that into the business case, right? To keep that a little bit longer. Now, where you can't do that is at senior leadership levels. You can't have two dueling senior vice presidents of the same thing. You can't have two dueling VPs of the same thing, right? But at the senior manager level, you can disperse the work. You know, well, you have this part of branding and you have this part of branding, or however you want to do it. But you do have to have a clear organizational structure. And so the other thing that I think AT&T did very well was every time they merged in, before the date of the merger happened or within, you know, a week of the merger closing, you had an organizational structure that said, this is how, you know, this is who's going to own what. And they sorted that very quickly. And then it was up to those folks to sort their organizations accordingly. And that takes a minute. That takes a minute.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, what about getting started? Here's a question from Darian, which is a good sort of capstone question here to tie this all together and bring together all the threads you've talked about so far, Kimberly. But what advice do you have for businesses beginning a digital or business transformation or an integration effort? Let's just broaden that a little bit to talk about, you know, specifically around integration or any sort of M&A integration, or they're trying to standardize. How do you get started? I imagine you probably come back to those three tenets that you started with, but how would you summarize that for us?
Yeah, well, you can call me and I'll help you. But yeah, so what I do is, if it's me, I will go in and I actually do extensive interviews, and I do it around the clear, ready, and aligned pillars. And so I start by listening. I mean, it's tried and true, right? It's road tested. Listening is your best friend there, right? And so the last engagement that I did, I interviewed 58 people. So 58 hours of interviews out of a 500-person company, right? So I went in and I really talked to them, and it's not a lot of questions, right? But it's questions that get them to open up about the challenges. I mentioned one earlier, right? Well, if your work had to double or triple and you weren't going to get more people, what do I need to help you fix? And so that really helps you get an independent third party's view of kind of what your challenges are, because I have seen time and again where leadership thinks they know what's going on, but they don't really know what's going on. And I've had CEO after CEO tell me, when you get the CEO job, nobody tells you the truth anymore. And you just have to know that as part of being a CEO, you're not getting the unadulterated truth from anybody anymore. And so even though you think you know what's going on, you probably don't. And so I like to talk to the people actually doing the work. And then that allows me, because they know what's broken. They know where the bodies are buried. They know these things. But either nobody's asked them, or when they've tried to bring it up in the past, no one's listened and done anything about it. And so that's where I always start. I always start with interviews, and I go through my clear, ready, and aligned assessment. And I'll give you a scorecard at the end that kind of says where you are on those scorecards. Truth is a scarce commodity. It is. It's a scarce commodity. Absolutely. I really want to know kind of what they think the situation on the ground is. And then I give a read out back to whoever the executive sponsor was that brought me in to say, look, this is what I'm hearing. This is what's going on. And then I put together a roadmap that says, based on where you've told me you want to be, and based on where I'm hearing you are, and based on the challenges that your teams have, if I were going to lead this is how I would go. And this is where I think you should tackle it. And, you may have different pillars that you need to tackle on. And then that kind of gives you a roadmap, and that'll tell you like how far away from your bogey are you, and how much is this going to cost, right? I mean, I'm not going to go and do a full business case based on just those interviews, right? But you can kind of tell, do you have 10 things to take care of, or do you have 3 things to take care of, right? The more things you have to take care of, the more it's going to cost.
Right.
Again, just getting that unbiased view of this is where our organization is, and not having rose-colored glasses about the situation. That's where I would always recommend everyone start.
Yeah, you're going to discover that at some point anyway. You might as well discover that as early on as possible, so you have a realistic plan of how you're going to tackle those challenges.
Yep.
So great stuff. Well, what are the best ways for people to connect with you if they want to just stay in touch with you, learn more from you? What are the best ways to connect?
Yeah, you can actually find me on LinkedIn, Kimberly Eubank. But then you also can, if you want to have a conversation with me, you can reach out at kimberlyeubank.com, my website, and just submit a contact form, and you can set some time on my calendar and we can have a conversation.
And really appreciated having her on the show, and appreciate all the great audience questions there as well. So thank you for that. We're going to shift gears here and have another guest on here in just a moment. We're going to bring on Jocelyn Hayes to talk about best practices in ERP implementation. So be sure to stick around. We're going to bring her on here in just a moment. But first, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say to me. I've been waiting for so long to hear.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me, or visit our website for more details.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting and your host of Transformation Ground Control. I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode.
I could never be the right kind of girl for you. I could never be your woman.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name is Eric Kimberly. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And we cover every week everything you need to know about strategy, people, process, technology, everything related to digital transformation. So be sure to check out past episodes at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And you can find new episodes every Wednesday. So I'm excited for our next guest. This is actually a clip of a podcast interview on our sister podcast called Journey to S4HANA. You can go to journeyto s4hana.com to learn more about that podcast, listen to all the past episodes. But the reason I like this interview and the reason we want to play it on this podcast, which this podcast is not specific to any technology, it's tech agnostic, of course, even though this discussion was in the context of SAP implementation best practices, most of what we talked about, if not all of what we talked about, is relevant to any sort of ERP implementation. It's a great conversation, so I thought it'd be great to play for you here in today's episode. So with that all being said, let's roll the clip of my interview with Jocelyn Hayes talking about best practices in ERP implementations. And you mentioned some of the other platforms that SAP has acquired, for example, Ariba on the procurement side and SuccessFactors within HR, Concur, Hybris on the CRM side. So you've got these different solutions that SAP has acquired over the years. How are those platforms being deployed with S4HANA? Or maybe put it another way, how do those platforms affect S4HANA implementations in your experience?
Well, if it's being done at the same time, it certainly increases your risk and your complexity of your project, and obviously the cost.
Right.
So, I would always encourage clients to try to limit their scope as much as possible without having to do a lot of rework down the road, and really be selective in what technologies they go with in their phase one round, so that they're not biting off more than they can chew. I think a lot of companies that try to do it all at once end up failing and having to restart and replan. And it ends up costing them a lot more money than just trying, than their original approach of trying to do it all at once.
Yeah. The other question I have a lot of times when we see clients that are thinking about implementing S4HANA along with one or more of these other bolt-on systems, for lack of a better word, even though they're all SAP, there are separate systems. But one thing I have to wonder too is do you really need them? Do you need SuccessFactors? Do you need Ariba? Or could you get by with the core functionality of S4HANA? And I think that's another question you often have to ask yourself, because I think if you're a sales rep, you might.
Yeah. Do you need Ariba as your purchasing processes and your those kinds of processes that complex that you need that additional tool? Or can you use the HCM in SAP or the HR modules in SAP and not necessarily have to have SuccessFactors? Absolutely. And, I would also, encourage customers, being on the focus on the business readiness side, is looking into some of the tools that will actually help support your operations as you go live. Recently, SAP purchased Signavio, which is a great tool to build out your business architecture, to really be able to lay out your business processes in an online format and be able to use that as part of your training materials, but also just educating your user base on how the processes are changing, and give them some of that while you're going through the implementation, and giving them some of that early look using that tool, because it has a collaboration hub that allows all of the users in the company to go look at what those future processes are by role. And then the other one that I think is very beneficial when you're going forward with an SAP implementation is Enable Now. So that's the in-application support tool that helps with not just your training materials, but also your in-application help. So when you get stuck on how to do something, you have it easily at your fingertips to get a tour of how to do a transaction, or to access some of those process documents, or to even go back to one of your courses that would teach you how to do the functions that you're getting stuck on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good reminder that there's some tools that'll enable the implementation, maybe make it a little bit easier, but then there's other ones that might actually complicate it or make it more risky, that you might want to either just validate that you really need those additional solutions and or push it off to phase 2, phase 3, or whatever later on.
And, of course, there is a price tag associated with those. There's the cost of the implementation, the cost of the licensing. Now, with the Rise and the Grow model, they do include starter kits for those, so you can try them out before you have to buy licenses for everybody. So there's enough for the project team to get going, and then you can decide later if you want to expand and get more user licenses. But that is one nice thing about that the grow and rise contracts is they give you a taste of a lot.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that.
And Signavio and Enable Now are those. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll come back and ask you some more about Grow and Rise now that you brought it up. I've got a follow up on that. But before I come back to that, I wanted to ask you too around just implementations in general. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see customers face, particularly if these challenges might be different than what they faced when they were first implementing ECC or R3 or maybe some non-SAP legacy product in the past? What are those biggest challenges you're seeing nowadays?
Well, sadly, it's the same thing you and I talked about 20 years ago when we met,
right?
Or 15 years ago, or whatever it was. We're seeing the same implementation mistakes, the same reasons for failure, the same reasons for the challenges as we did back then. And it really boils down to, is it a business-led project, not IT-led? And a lot of times, you'll go to a client and they'll feel like it's business-led because, the CEO or the COO or the VP of sales is standing up and saying, we're going to do this, and they're supportive of it. But it still is run on a day-to-day basis by the IT team and the CIO. And that's got to change if these projects are going to be successful. So I would say truly make it business-led, make your not just your executive sponsor, but even your program manager, someone from the business, and have them fully involved in it. And it starts at the leadership level, but it goes down all the way down, within the organization to the user level. And, I often tell clients, we always used to talk about that 3 in the box where you have a consultant, somebody from IT for that module, and then somebody from the business. But often that third role, that business role, either they're fully on the project and not going back and talking to the business, and they're kind of expected to cover not just their division, but all of the divisions. So maybe the project's being implemented by 10 divisions and they represent one, so they're only giving the voice of one. And they're never encouraged to go back and talk to the other 9 and build a community with those other 9. So something I always want to do when I start on these projects is I'll take that one business person in the box and say, let's identify all the people you need to be communicating with as your change agent, your informal change agents and business representation. And let's come up with a plan for how often you're going to check in with them. And I really encourage them to spend as much as 25 to 50% of their time going back and talking to the business about what they've done, even if they feel like it's not quite ready. Everybody wants to wait until they have something that they can ta-da and show, and all their master data is in there, all their process, it's almost fully tested. But there's so much you can do further up this upstream to start those conversations and to get people really understanding what's going to be changing and how roles might change and how they're going to get the value of it. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing is when you go live, who's measuring that you're actually going to get your ROI on this, and it's not just a lift and shift of your technology.
I'm here with Jocelyn Hayes. We're talking about ERP implementation best practices and lessons learned. We've got a lot more to cover, so stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you'll want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
I recently published my first book. It's called The Final Countdown: Strategies to Reach the Third Stage of Digital Transformation. And I wrote this book because I really wanted to find a concise way to share some of my knowledge around digital strategy and how to get started on a digital transformation journey. So in this book, I cover 3 different sections. I cover the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation, with the idea that it's meant to be a starting point, a launching pad for organizations and team members that are going through digital transformations. So I encourage you to buy this book. You can get it electronically, you can get it paperback, or you can get it in hard copy, as I'm holding here in front of you. You can get it by going to thefinalcountdown.com. You can also search for it on Amazon if you shop at Amazon. Otherwise, just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Love to hear your feedback on this book as well. So I hope you check it out and hope you enjoy.
And I'll do anything you ever dreamed to be complete. Yes, I'm nothing that's all.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 176. My name is Eric Kimberly. You can find new episodes every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And the show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. If you'd like to learn more about how we can help with your digital transformation, be sure to reach out to myself, or you can reach out to thirdstage-consulting.com. And we're here with Jocelyn Hayes. We're talking about some best practices and lessons learned from ERP implementations. Let's jump back into the conversation. You know, let's face it and call a spade a spade. A lot of customers are going to S4HANA right now because they have to, because they don't want to deal with the end of life, lack of support for ECC and R3. So a lot of customers are not thinking necessarily strategically. They're thinking more reactively to, SAP is cutting off support, so therefore I need to move to S4HANA, preferably cloud, by the way, ASAP, basically. So what, how do you convince customers to not think so reactively and think more strategically about what they want out of S4HANA, so they're getting the full value that you allude to there?
Well, it always depends on the customer and to know your audience, right? And who you're speaking to at the customer. But sometimes I'll use the scare tactics of telling them about historical projects that I've either been a part of or have familiarity with, and give them some real live examples of how these things have failed by not having their involvement. I'll also try to play the what if scenarios, like, what if you are expecting this particular change or new way of working that is going to get you X return, and it doesn't happen? What are you going to do then? How are you going to go back and fix it, and try to put yourself in that future state? We always say, like, what would you tell your 7-year-old self?
Right.
Kind of try to put yourself in that situation. Try to come up with some of those analogies to get them to make it a little more personal to them, and not just a story that they hear about another company that failed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You also alluded to adoption and getting people to use the system and getting the value out of the system. What are some of the tips or best practices you've seen work best to get your employees comfortable with S4HANA and familiar with the new workflows and all that stuff?
Well, so I think it first starts with working with those business representatives and those communities that those business representatives have built out to identify where are the biggest changes and the biggest impacts to the organization of what we've been showing you. And then you take those and you say, okay, if we don't do that change, what is the cost of it? And you challenge them to actually put some dollars or some hours or some measure around the cost of not doing it. Then you come back and you're like, well, how can we measure that they actually do it? Let's pretend we've gone live and we want to go back and measure, did they do that? How can we tactically measure that? Because I think a lot of companies don't think about that. They don't think about, well, I could actually be running reports in the system that are going to give me some information about whether they're doing something properly or not. Are they having to kick an invoice back 5 times for whatever errors, or because somebody didn't do something downstream in a data governance organization? But like, how are we actually going to measure this stuff when we go live, and do that in advance, and don't wait until afterwards, because it's really hard to chase it after.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think identifying the changes to people and their jobs and how it's going to affect their workflows, I think that's a great way to start, because that's really sort of that grassroots. That's where the grassroots adoption is going to happen in their world, not just the big picture of how SAP is being deployed, but more specifically, how is it being deployed for that individual or that work group, and how's it going to affect their jobs?
Right. Well, and then of course, working with the mid-level management to ensure that they understand the cost of not doing those changes, and put some ownership on them, and put it as part of their KPIs for their performance metrics. So it's really important to like actually try to measure what matters
Right.
in these projects, but figure out in advance what you want to measure so that when you do go live, you're measuring it. And that you've also talked in advance to the communities about here's what we're going to measure to make sure we're successful, so that they know that those are the important things they've got to do to change, to reap the benefits of the system.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy to say, but it's so hard to do.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned a few minutes ago about how when you and I met 15 years ago, or when you and I started in this industry close to 30 years ago, I think we both started around the same time. It's amazing to see how many of these same mistakes keep getting repeated year after year, decade after decade. So it's always fun to unpack and talk about, what should be happening that's a little bit different than the way companies have implemented technology in the past.
Yeah. And I'd like to touch on another part of of where failure comes from,
Sure.
Or challenges. So, we know that every SAP customer, when they're doing an SAP implementation, typically go with a system integrator, with an SI. And it can be, tier 1, tier 2 SI, it doesn't matter. Their job is for solution readiness. And then, what I'm talking about is business readiness. Their job is not to get your business ready. They'll say they are, but ideally, really, if you look at their contracts, at the end of the day, they're responsible for getting your solution ready. And they'll say that we're going to make it meet your business requirements, and it's going to, we're going to use as much of the standard operating practices in the system, the best practices. We're not going to customize things as much as they, but it really comes down to they're there to get the solution ready. So who's there to get the business ready? The businesses. So it has to, again, going back, it has to be business led, and you have to make sure that you have the right commitment in place for the time and the energy of those people from the business that are going to be in that project.
Right. Yeah, because you could do a bang up job on the S/4HANA technical deployment and build the software exactly the way the organization wants it built, but you could still end up with shelfware that doesn't end up getting used, or ends up getting
or exactly the way that the solution is designed to be built, but doesn't necessarily allow the customer to continue the things that differentiate them, because it's boxed them into something that it's just not going to work for their business. So it's really important to be very clear as you're going into these projects. What is it that makes you unique? What is your quote unquote value proposition to your customers that we can't change, that's not negotiable? So that it's very clear to those people implementing the solution that they've got to honor that. And if it means customizing a part of the application or doing some kind of thing outside of the application to be able to provide that capability to your organization, then that needs to be planned for.
Yeah. Yeah. And you used the term business readiness a moment ago, which is a great word. But it leads me to another question, which is when you're, what are the ways to get ready, prior to starting an implementation or prior to bringing in your system integrator? What are some of the things that organizations should be thinking about doing as a way to accelerate the project later on, but not necessarily having to wait until the SI gets their army of consultants on board?
Yep. So it always comes down to people and process, but there's also some other caveats that might fall into the technology area. So when I think of the people and process things you can do in advance, it's really starting to maybe build some of those communities of practice within the organization. So if you know you're not going to do this SAP project for a year from now, even though I know that 2027 clock is ticking fast, but let's say you've got a little bit of time before you're going to start. One thing you can start to do is identify, who is going to be on the project full time, but then who are the other people in the organization that are going to be part of that community. So let's say you've got a buyer that you've identified that's going to be on the project. Find, the buyers from the 7 other divisions that are going to be part of that community, and have them actually start talking to each other and figuring out how they do their work. Figure out where they're different, so that when they do get to the point when they're in a workshop and the SI is coming in and showing them how the SAP works, then that person in the back of their mind is not only thinking about how they do it in their job, but how the other 7 people in their community do it. So that's one thing that you could start to do, is build those communities of practice. And it also starts to build, a lot of these companies are doing this because they want to be one company. This allows you to start moving down that path of that cultural path. Another thing you can do too is build kind of another community, but like a master data ownership governance group. So a lot of companies, sadly, IT doesn't necessarily own the data, but they manage the data.
Right.
So in turn, it makes everybody feel like they own, IT owns the data. They're always the ones that are even creating the data for them. So change that organization structure. Move the data maintenance, the data governance to the business. Identify your customer data stewards. Identify your material master stewards. And again, build those communities and start to identify where can we clean up our data, where can we standardize our data, where can we combine our data. All those things because when we go live, I always tell clients like of the tickets that come in that are related to the system, that 80% of those tickets are data related. It's not because the system doesn't work. It's almost 80% data related. And then of the 100% of the tickets that come in, 50%, the top 50 are user readiness related. Like people just don't know how to do something. They weren't trained well enough. And then the other 50% are system related, but of the system related ones, 80% are master data. So master data is by far the biggest thing you can do in preparation for your SAP implementations. So those are the two things I think are really important to do if you've got some time before you're starting your project. And if you don't, do it as soon as the project starts.
All right, great stuff. Thank you, Jocelyn. Good to have you on the show here. Even though technically she was on a sister podcast, she didn't know we were going to use that same interview for this podcast, but she's getting a double appearance without even knowing it. So thank you for that, Jocelyn. And hopefully, even though that was focused on SAP implementations, like I said, most of what we talk about there is relevant to any sort of ERP implementation. So loved having her on the show and hope to have her on again soon. So that's what we've got for you today. I want to thank you for joining here today. Also want to be sure you take advantage of that early bird discount I mentioned at the beginning of the show for our Digital Stratosphere Conference in Denver, October 2nd through the 4th. I'll be keynote speaking at it. There'll be probably about 20 or 25 other great speakers from throughout the world. Some big name speakers as well. So be sure to check out the agenda. It's continuing to get updated daily at stratosphere2024.com. If you buy your tickets by the end of June, you get 20% off. Hope to see you there. It's October 2, 3, and 4 in Denver, Colorado, in the United States. Hope to see you there. And there's if you aren't able to make it to the United States, by the way, there's also hybrid options as well, or virtual options as well. So we'll be streaming it live as well, so you can buy virtual passes if you aren't able to join in person. So be sure to check that out. So glad that you're able to join our podcast here in the meantime. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Transformation Ground Control.